Thanks very much. It's really nice to be with you, even virtually, to talk a little bit about some stuff that I was doing actually in London, since we were just talking about that. Uh, Please do, there may be points in which things kind of come too quickly. So please stop me if you have some clarification questions. I think we could leave the deep objections, I'm sure, will be coming in the Q&A, but definitely stop for clarification. So I want to talk a little bit about intending as remembering. And I'll begin, and this is a quote that's on the outline. It's a little bit inscrutable because it's just taken out of context. This is from Desposito and Puzzle in a review about the working memory literature in empirical cognitive science. But it expresses a view that I don't find in philosophy, and I think it's worth bringing out, which is that, as they say, these capacities that we label attention and intention and retention, memory, might be treated identically by the brain. Okay, so I think the identity claim is too strong, but they're expressing something that I don't find in sort of the philosophical literature, which is these three fundamental capacities of mind are really tightly linked. And that's what I want to bring out today. So I'll review some of the stuff that I've written, which attempts to argue that intention and attention are fundamentally linked in intentional action. And then the new material, if you don't know that work, so if you know that work, the new material will be in connecting intention to memory. So by way of kind of introducing that connection, we can think of intention as the basis of the agent's control when she acts intentionally, and I'll bring that out again in a moment. But there's also a sense in which her intention is a kind of memory, which I will bring out. And this memory has the additional functional role of grounding or being the basis of her conception of her action as intentional. And that's what I'll call the thesis of the continuity of practical memory. That's on the bottom of page 1, if you want to take a look at what that states. This form of memory provides a kind of distinctive access to her action, and it keeps track of her action by her updating her memory. And this form of updating involves practical reasoning. And so it's 4, 5, and 6, I think, or 3 to 6 that are sort of the main new aspects of what I want to talk about today. And let me just mention, because I was in the UK, as I mentioned to some of you now, on a sabbatical. I'm working on a book called Movements of the Mind, ostensibly about mental action, but really a theory of agency. I just wanted to run some of the chapters through here, and some point in the near future, actually, I would like to get some feedback on this. So if any of this material interests you, please let me know, and I'm happy to share that work with you. So there's a chapter on the structure of action and on intention and intending, which we'll talk a bit about today just by way of review. So I'll make a bunch of assertions. And then intending as a kind of memory. And then there are 3 chapters that are involved in sort of special cases, reasoning or inferring. Introspection of consciousness is some material that Keith has heard me present in other contexts. And then implicit bias and automaticity and agency and thinking. Okay, so the new stuff will be this, but the chapters 3 and 4, that's where I'm extracting some of this material from. But I'll start by way of talking about prior work as a way of fleshing out this particular idea of the connection between intention and attention. So I belong as part of this tradition started, I think, really by Donald Davidson in 1963. Causal accounts of action, where we're trying to explain conditions for intentional movement of the body by appeal to the causes of those movements, belief-desire pair, intention. And as you all know, challenges were raised to this, I think really quite devastating challenges to at least the initial proposals in terms of causal deviance. That is, that you could maintain these causal conditions and yet generate a movement of the body, but not, as Davidson later put it, in the right way. And I think, looking at those examples, it becomes clear that there's a sort of certain elements of agency that are missing. That I think a nice paper that's, I think, read less frequently in 1970 by Harry Frankfurt, which suggests that, look, what we really need to explain are things like executive capacities of the agent and controlling and guiding her behavior in intentional action. Okay, so this is sort of, old history. what I try and do is to sort of think about that in terms of what I now call the selection problem. In published work, I call it the many problem for reasons that will become apparent in a second. I think this is in fact a necessary feature of all agency. That is to say, one must solve this problem. And the problem can be just phrased as a question: what should I do, or what is to be done? The structure will be familiar to people who work in robotics and neuroscience. And let me just sort of explain the basic idea. This is what I call an action space for an individual. It's a causal map, but it's really meant to identify subject level mental states on the one side and response capacities on the other. So there could be a capacity to move, to apply a concept, to hold a memory. On the input side, there'll be mental states of various sorts. And for example, there's the world that impinges on the sensory system. So you might visually experience colors. And there are going to be many things that you can do depending on the number of response capacities that you have. You can point to the color, you can paint it, you can say what color it is verbally, you can put it in your memory, you can categorize it. And these vertical arrows up and down are just to remind you that there are many capacities and many input states. So the question is, what should you do? Because each of these dotted lines here represents a behavior or an action, a coupling of an input to an output. And so if the selection problem can be phrased as a question, what is to be done? Then of course, action would be a solution to that, right? It answers that question. Now, the fact that the solid line is just to indicate that that's the behavioral path that you in fact take. But you might ask why that particular one, because there are a huge number of possible paths. I've only drawn 4 of them. And this is where I think we can actually use this selection problem to make more precise the causal role of an intention. So on the one hand, what we can say, first of all, is that the content of the intention helps to explain why a particular solution is taken, because it's that particular action that satisfies the intention's content. Okay, so with the action in view, we can sort of describe it in the following way, that when an agent acts intentionally, she's responding, right, exercising a capacity response that's guided by how she's taking things visually in this case. And this is all in light of what she intends. Okay, so I think this is just a way of describing intentional action. And so you can think of action as having this kind of, if you like, geometrical causal structure with 3 essential points here. And now, again, I'm just doing a bit of summary and assertion. I do think, and although this would take a bit more argument, that the proper way of thinking about causation in action when we appeal to states like intention is that they're actually constituents of action. Okay. Now, remember, the issue was, how do we explain these fundamental notions? And I, again, leveraged that structure by thinking about intention and attention as answering this question. So let me begin with intention. The influence of intention as the basis of the agent's control expressed in her acting is through this kind of influence. And here now, because I think we have a responsibility, if we're, as philosophical psychologists, postulating processes in the mind, to take seriously cognitive science. I think in that sense, we become part of the project of cognitive science. And this sort of downward arrows here, I think of in terms of the idea of a bias. And this notion I get from neurobiology. Again, this is a 2017 paper, which is also in the handout that you can hyperlink to. I talk there about cognitive penetration, but I prefer now to call it in a more neutral way, cognitive integration. The idea that the cognitive state of intention, in a way, integrates with these capacities. And I think I think this is a necessary aspect. All actions instantiate the structure. And so it ought to be that the biology is a way of constituting that structure. And I think it does. So this is just to point out an idea in neuroscience, beginning with the idea that, so here's the human brain, here's the back, the visual system, the front of the brain. One thing we know about the brain is that it's capacity limited in the very precise sense that there are energy limitations. To signal, a neuron has to generate action potentials, and that requires energy. And so all these neurons, which are represented here, that are responsive to these 2 stimuli, they're competing with each other for these limited resources. That's the competition. And the competition has to be resolved, otherwise the brain doesn't do further processing to be the organ of agency, which it is. And so in this diagram, it's the toast that wins out, maybe because you want to eat. Right? And so that information indicated in red is further processed, and there's a block here. So that, in other words, there's a bias that resolves the competition at the neural level. And now this diagram here, I think, should make you think, if you'd like, of a kind of competition that exists in this structure that I've identified here. Because if you'd like, all these different possibilities here are also competing for the control of action. You can sort of overlay these ideas on top of each other. And that should follow for me, because this action structure, I think, is necessary in agency. If the brain is the organ of agency, then these two ideas should line up. And just to give you another sort of broader picture, this is Paul Chiswick's work, again, looking at visually guided action, a different part of the visual system here, which is involved in the control of motor control. Lots of information coming in, lots of many different actions that you can perform. Again, that should make you think of the selection problem. Typically, we think of this large part of the brain as sort of the seat of intention, or at least forming the plans and rules. And that is the source of the bias here. All right, so again, this is just to point out that that general structure has this echo at the level of our biology as biological agents. Okay, you'll also note that attention suddenly appears here, and I'll come back to that in just 2 slides. My point here is just to say, look, there's a notion of intention. I've made, I hope, more precise the causal role of an intention. And here, I think this is where the biology is usefully illuminative about our thinking about philosophical psychology. Okay, how about attention? And here I'm just going to go with William James, because I think James got it right. James claimed that this is something we all know. It's a sort of well-known characterization of attention. Let me just bring out the important parts. Attention is taking possession, the mind's taking possession of one out of several possible objects or trains of thought. It implies withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others. And I think you can just, if you take that description, I think you can find attention here quite naturally, right? Because here, presumably, we have visual attention. And so what is it here that is attention? It's the mind's taking possession of one out of many possible targets in order to deal effectively with it. So in other words, the point of attention is that it's in the business of guiding behavior. That's the Jamesian idea. And because it's naturally found here, and if this structure is necessary for action, then it follows from me that attention is necessary for action. And that's a 2018 paper that's linked there in the outline if you want to see a more detailed argument for that. Okay, let's say I'm right. And again, I'm just making assertions here based on past work summarizing it. If I'm right about attention, you will note, if you know the literature and the philosophy of action, that since 1963, almost no one has talked systematically about attention. If attention really is a necessary component of action, then there's no way that that theory could have ever been complete, because it's left out something critical. Okay. All right, now in this structure, one thing that I think follows, at least for acting with an intention, intentional action in that sense, is that intention biases and thereby sets attention, or if you'd like more generally, control sets guidance. Okay, so that's a very general quick tour. There's obviously a lot to say there, and I'm just going to leave you with one messy picture, which is just to note that attention is actually quite complicated. So this is a famous study by Alfred Yarbus, who developed technology to track eye movements. And so we're just looking at the pattern of someone who's looking at this painting. And what you'll find is that over, I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes, the eye moves a lot and focuses, you can see the areas of fixation and so forth. Okay, so the theory that I've just given you should explain things like this. But I just want to put up the picture without much more comment, and maybe we'll come back to it in Q&A, as a way of thinking about how attention is this kind of messy thing, and yet it seems to also exhibit a kind of order. Okay, so this is the end of the summary of just going back to the Esposito and Postle quote about these 3 capacities and thinking about the relationship between intention and attention. It's fundamental to agency. All right, so now let's shift to intention, some new material, and the second idea of its connection to memory. And here I want to give an argument about the importance of what I'll call practical memory. So to bring that out, here's a thought experiment. So consider a conversation that I'm having with you. So you tell me it's going to rain cats and dogs, a heavy downpour, and then I respond by telling you I better grab an umbrella. And at that point, if you'd like, you can ask me, well, why did you say that? Or someone can ask me that. And here you're probing for what my conception is of what I've just done. And I think the thing I would say is I'm responding to S, to you, right? You told me something about the weather. It made me think that I should grab an umbrella, and I'm telling you about that. So my conception of my action here is as an answer or response to what you say, but that's past looking, right? And to bring that out, consider what happens if I were to able to manipulate, you were able to manipulate my memory. So this idea of like targeted amnesia. So in principle, I think we can do this someday. So here's what you might be able to do in that future. You simply wipe my memory of what was said. So at this moment then, when someone at time t3, or as I'm starting to utter this, let's say, you wipe my memory. And now someone asks me, what did I do? Having lost track of what was said, at best, all I can say is that, well, I'm responding to something, I forget exactly what you said. I might be able to infer what you said given what I'm saying. But again, at that point, my grasp of my own action as intentional is starting to become more tenuous. And it becomes completely tenuous if you wipe my memory completely. And so now from my perspective, as I'm uttering these words, they're just kind of this random expression or utterance. So then the question why is not something that I can answer in the way that I normally answer. Right? I've lost access to the past that provides a context for what I'm doing, understood as an intentional response. Right, so the point here is that, in fact, this idea of thinking about what we're doing depends on memory. It depends on our connection to what has gone on before. And I think this relates to Anscombe's question of, when she said that intentional action is subject to this particular question of why did you do that? For us to be in a position to answer that, I think we need to maintain this continuity of remembering what we've done, this idea of practical memory. So here's a formulation of it. Again, it's on the handout. In action, what one is now intentionally doing is intelligible as intentional action because of its link to the remembered past in practical memory. Right? So this, in other words, that argument was meant to secure the idea that memory is an important part of our grasp of our intentional action. And the thing I would add to this is that the basis of that is intention. So that might be a different way of thinking about intention, because the arguments about intention are usually, can it be reduced to a belief and desire? Is it a belief? Is it its own sui generis state? But I think thinking about it as memory is somewhat novel, and also I think, as I will argue for the rest of the talk, very useful. One, I think of intention as a kind of cognitive representation of actions to be done. I say cognitive because it has a fundamental role to play in reasoning, right? So we often think about it as the basis of the generation of our behavior. But as Michael Brahman and others people have pointed out, of course, it has this fundamental role to play in reasoning, right? It can be the input to reasoning. We can reason over our intentions, and it can also be an output. And as an output to practical reasoning, it's the result of one's bringing that reasoning to a close in decision. Right? That's an event, an achievement of setting our mind to doing something. The decision is over once one's had that, one has that experience, but it sets an intention, and the intention carries the content of the decision forward in time. So the way to think about intention in this context is that it's set, it reflects the content of a previous experience, but that's a pretty good description of memory. In this particular case, it's the memory of what is to be done, what one decided. Right? It's related to action. That's why it's a practical memory. It's a particular kind of memory that's tied to past decision, but it's also memory that has this functional role of generating action or memory for work. All right, so the point here is that we need a kind of practical memory to keep hold of our action as intentional, right? And I'm suggesting that intention is the basis. It is that practical memory. Now, I choose this idea of memory for work deliberately because I think there's a lot in cognitive science that informs this idea of practical memory, which is working memory. So I'm going to sort of go over a bit of some of the empirical research on working memory. Just to start off with this quote from Klaus Oberauer, a kind of review of working memory. So he's talking about a broad consensus on among working memory theorists in science. The term refers to a set of mechanisms of processes that hold mental representations currently most needed for an ongoing cognitive action. available for processing for that action, right? So working memory keeps action-relevant memoranda accessible. The other thing I would point out is that the thought here about working memory is that it's a kind of mechanism or process. So it's sort of below the hood, if you like. It's somewhat subpersonal, if we're going to use that terminology. Philosophers, I think, haven't really been thinking about working memory. There's some exceptions. So in the theory of consciousness, discussions about the global workspace theory, about phenomenal overflow, Ned Block's work there, is connected to working memory. And also Peter Carruthers has been doing a lot on working memory in terms of a sensory basis of cognition. But I think for most of us, and certainly for me coming to this, the thinking about working memory was something like holding a bunch of numbers in mind. That would be a standard example. So here's a sequence of numbers, 141226833319. And you can try and remember that if you'd like, just for a few seconds. And in experiments in psychology, when the screen goes blank, this is the so-called delay period. And so you're maintaining that. You might be saying it in inner speech. And then I can test you. I can ask you to write it down, or I can ask you to verify whether this is the same sequence of numbers. Okay. I won't ask for a show of hands, right? But now these tasks are used to measure working memory capacity. That's been an important part of the research on working memory. This particular kind of task is called a simple span task, a span of symbols that you retain. And these measurements have led people to postulate that there are about 4 slots, so to speak, where each slot can contain a chunk. And a chunk in that literature can be illustrated in the following way. Look at 412. For most of you, I gather, this has no real significance. So you put each numeral in a slot, so it would take up 3 slots for you. But for me, from Pittsburgh, I know that 412 is in fact the area code for phone numbers here in my area. So I can chunk that together and only take up 1 slot. Okay, so people have been worried about slots, but here's the point. In doing this task just now, if you did it, you were doing something intentionally. It's an intentional action. So it should fit the structure that I've identified earlier. So in the book, I talk a bit about what I call a conduit of memoranda. And here I'm going to break the action down into 3 parts. There's the encoding of the memory, keeping it in mind and then holding on to it. So maintaining it, maybe through inner speech in this case. And then you might access it. As Oberon put it, the point of having this in mind is that we can guide behavior. So if I give you a phone number, right, you encode it, you might say it over and over again in inner speech, and then you might try and dial it or write it down, or in an experiment, type it out. Okay? Again, I call it a conduit because it's kind of shifting of content. And I remind you that this is like an action. So we start off with a perception of the number, and there's a set of responses that we can generate. We put it in memory in this case, but you could do other things with it, of course. And again, once you have it in memory, there's a set of responses. One thing is just to maintain that memory. That's the maintenance. And again, what are the responses that you can map to? Well, a response could be just dialing it, for example. So again, this is what I mean. There's a set of contents that proceed over time. One thing I want to emphasize is that you can modify the content of the memory. You can manipulate it. And so in that sense, you might think of this as still in the mind rather than an output in bodily movement, where I now change that content in some way. All right, and this kind of change is really going to be central to my idea of practical remembering. So I want to highlight that there, right? So this would be an aspect of memory, but it's about changing the content of memory. Okay, so we have this condition that I'm working with, this continuity of practical memory. And then for any kind of mental action, or indeed any action, so R could be a bodily movement, the question is, what is this practical memory? And the suggestion is that it's memory for work. Right. This is a really interesting quote from Miller et al. And many of you might know Miller, if you know him at all, as the author of a paper called The Magical Number 7 ± 2. Here is a book that he wrote with Galanter and Prebraum in 1960, the title of which could be a title of a philosophical treatise on action, where I think it's one of the earliest instances of the use of the term working memory in psychology. It might be the second as far as I'm able to track down. The first was through to Herb Simon, who was at CMU. Right? So here's what they say. The memory that we use for the execution of our plans is a kind of quick access working memory. And that's the fixing of the term. And here's sort of what it does. Plans are transferred into working memory, and when there are they're incompleted parts, they have a special status. We'll call them intentions. I think this is fundamentally important because if you think about working memory in terms of slots, we're missing on what's really interesting about working memory. It was postulated as a way of regulating behavior in connection to intentions. And so this sort of makes sense of this summary by Miyake and Shaw. It's a really nice volume that they edited, having the main working memory theorists in cognitive science write about what working memory is. This is the end essay where they're summarizing. And they say the following: working memory is not for memorizing per se. And I understand that just to mean don't keep fixating on these span tasks. Rather, working memory is in the service of complex actions, I think, in general, but the focus has been on mental actions. Cognitive activities such as language processing, reading comprehension, visual spatial thinking, navigation, reasoning, problem solving, and decision making. And you can see that, just thinking about slots is not going to be very useful for really thinking about the role of working memory in regulating behavior. So if we take this bigger idea and now look at the actual models of working memory, I think it's sort of transformative, right? So here's the most famous model, I think. This is Alan Badley and Hitch's model in 1974, which some of you might know. We do have the so-called slave systems or working memory stores, but there's also the central executive, which is there to regulate the maintenance of information here, like in the simple span tasks. And so you might, in inner speech, when you're repeating the numbers to yourself, that would be an activation of the phonological loop. Later on, Badley modified this. So here's and this is from a paper in 2003, which is also, you can download from the outline hyperlink. He added another slave system. This is normally thought of as short-term memory here. Working memory is a kind of short-term memory. And then he put in connections to long-term memory as well. If you know the working memory literature, you'll know that Nelson Cowan is also a major figure in this, and this is his model, which I think is just a different way of thinking about the kind of ideas that Badley put forward. And I'll simply highlight here that this sort of short-term memory is distinguished from long-term memory, and then there's this idea of attention here, which I'll come back to. Okay, people were very interested in the capacity of working memory in science. And we already talked about simple span tasks. And you might think like, oh, that's a very good measure of working memory capacity because it's just how much you can hold in mind at a given moment in time. But in fact, it's not the way that people like to measure capacity. In fact, they prefer a different kind of span task, what they call the complex span task. You still, in this context here, have simple span, right? You're still asking the subject to remember a sequence of numerals. But what's interesting about this sort of paradigm is that you add a second task. So in this case, for reading span, the question is does this sentence make sense? Is it grammatical? He is gone. No. She is happy. Yes. Okay. So you're doing two things at once. If you'd like, you have to form two intentions and regulate attention so that it's tied to the right response, so that you know you're doing something about grammatical assessment or you're retaining something in memory. All right. And there are different versions of this. Now, why is this preferred? Well, the first thing is just to note the difference between these two kinds of tasks. A complex span task is designed to force storage in the face of distraction in order to engage executive attention processes, right? To multitask, you're going to have to regulate attention. And the other reason that it's preferred is that, in fact, it turns out that the measures of capacity in complex span are better correlated with standard measures of intelligence. Right? And that's why, since people have always assumed that working memory is central to understanding these kinds of higher level cognitive behaviors, that given these correlations, working memory capacity through complex span as measured by complex span, that's the better measure. All right, so now attention is now front and center. And now if you look at some of the major theorists and they're thinking about this, the slots are kind of going away. I mean, they're there, of course, because it is memory. But what's really critical about working memory is the ability here, as Engel puts it, to control attention. And the reason for doing that is that you want to maintain attention on the tasks that you're supposed to perform and avoid distraction. Right, this is 2018. Badley, though, 16 years earlier, in a paper on the central executive, clearly noted that the point of the function of the executive is to regulate the attentional control of behavior, and that if we're going to understand working memory and these cognitive activities, we're going to have to understand attention and the control of action. Okay, so this is really putting us in familiar territory. So I want to go back to the Cowan model here, right? The idea is that we have the store, we have the central executive, and we're going to regulate attention. But I've drawn his model in a way purposely to kind of put in view a structure that we're already familiar with from philosophical psychology, which is the structure of intentional action, which is that we have intention, which part of its functional role is to generate action through biasing and setting attention. But that is in fact the functional role attributed to the central executive. And so the way I would line these up is that working memory theorists are working below the hood, so to speak. They're looking at mechanisms by which attention is regulated for the guidance of a variety of behaviors. Intention has that role too. And so I think the way to bridge these things is to understand these processes at this level as constituting subject level capacities or expressions of intention. So in that sense, the way I like to think about working memory research, which is vast, is that a lot of it is probing intention and the regulation of attention. Right? And this is why I think there's a lot to be said for that initial quote from Postel and D'Esposito. Okay, so intention is this kind of active memory, which is driven by the central executive, which regulates attention, and that should make you think of intention, which has the same functional role. I think experimentally, you manipulate the two in the same way by providing instructions, setting a subject's intention. And so again, my hypothesis is that you line these two things up because the central executive is the algorithmic or mechanistic basis of things that we talk about when we talk about intention. And that means that we can leverage a lot of this research as a way of understanding the role of intention. Okay. So I think going back to this quote, I think that's part of why they're saying what they're saying here. I think the identity claim is too strong, but clearly these three ideas are linked together in very important ways. And I think we see that best when we think about what it is to be a human agent, an intentional agent. Okay, so now I want to talk about sort of things of more philosophical interest, which is, again, this was again on your handout, but a set of things I wanted to discuss. And I'm going to now focus on the idea that that this sort of practical memory provides us as agents with our distinctive access to action, that this memory is updated as a way for us to keep track of our action, and that this updating involves practical reasoning. So the rest of the discussion will focus on this. All right, in terms of access, as Oberard pointed out, the whole point of working memory is to postulate a kind of accessibility that's tied to our plans, going back to the Miller quote. I think that's really the broad fundamental conception of working memory. Intention has those properties as well, and intention in action is just intention in the midst of controlling action. So I am thinking about intention in action as the basis of our access to our action as it's being done. And this access amounts to a kind of cognitive attention. So here are 4 properties, some of which we also attribute to introspection, that I think fall out of thinking about access as itself a kind of action. The first is that access is direct. The intention constitutes a kind of attention to one's action. This access is also non-observational because that attention is a form of cognitive attention, not perceptual. Because of the basis of this access, it's distinctively first personal, in that sense peculiar. It's only the agent herself who can attend to action, her action in this way. The rest of us on the outside have to do it perceptually, or we do it by inference. This access is also privileged. The intention in action is generally reliable in bringing about the action that it represents. If that intention in action is also the basis of our access to the action, then the access will also be reliably accurate. Okay, so I'm not going to discuss this in detail beyond just showing you how these ideas fall naturally out of thinking about access as a kind of intentional action. We can talk about more details in Q&A. So remember, here you're doing something intentionally. There's an intention. And if I now ask you, what are you doing, for example, or sorry, you ask me that, then I might report that I am And here I'm just, if you'd like, reading off the content of my intention. Notice that this here has the structure of a behavior. There's a mental input state and there's a response. And so this itself, as I mentioned, is an intentional action. There's an intention that I haven't drawn up here. But now by the Jamesian account of attention, right, this is the mind's taking possession of one out of many relevant objects, trains of thought. And in that sense, we have a kind of direct access. That is to say, this constitutes attention to its content, which is the action that is being performed. So it's direct in the sense I'm attending to my action and accessing it. It's non-observational because intention is not a perceptual state, it's a cognitive state. And so this would constitute a kind of non-observational access. It's peculiar because only the agent can use her own intention as the basis of her attending to her action. We are not in a position to do that since our minds are distinct. And again, the privilege should come about because if this is reliable in the generation of the behavior that's being represented, then my access to that behavior through my intention should also be reliable. All right, and something that Louise and Keith and I have talked about in other contexts, and I'm just going to throw this out there. I think a lot of these properties also just fall out if we talk about introspection of perceptual consciousness. Again, that would be a kind of action, and it would also have the same structure. And what's distinctive about introspection, this is the 6th chapter in the book that I'm trying to finish, is that one's own experience provides the basis of attention to one's experience. And so on this view, those of you who know the literature on introspection and consciousness, the transparency view falls out as an entailment of thinking about introspection as an action. Okay, that was a little bit of an aside to a few of you. Let me now turn to the idea of fine-tuning and intention as a way of keeping track of one's action. So what do I mean by fine-tuning? It's changing the content of an intention so as to facilitate solving the selection problem. And the idea here is that the notion of a bias is to help explain how, in intending to act in a certain way, we constrain the set of possible solutions to the selection problem. So here's a way of thinking about it. If you look at this, again, action space, now highlight the vertical lines because I want to emphasize that there are many possible behavioral paths. In the absence of intention and any other bias, there are all these things you could do, and you're like Buridan's ass in the sense that there's no basis for choosing them yet. Intention is a basis of basically settling certain things, and that depends on its content. Its content is going to bias where in this space of action you're going to be. And one way that it does that, and this is just a point to something that I can discuss further, is that it sets a kind of vigilance, a propensity to attend, right? I'm ready to kind of attend to the red thing because I want to act on red things. And so in this, then I am ready to act. Okay, so the idea of fine-tuning then is just to help solve the problem by isolating that part of action space, which is relevant to the intention. So the challenge is that intentions, the contents of intentions are generally too general to engage action. I want to eat some cake. I intend to eat some cake. What kind of cake? Chocolate cake, carrot cake. I can fine-tune my intentions, and that closes the gap, right? It makes more specific what I need to do if I'm going to satisfy my intention. And that might require means and reasoning. There's no cake unless I bake some or go buy some, okay? Or if I'm lucky, there's a piece of cake. And now it's a kind of target identification. I intend to eat some cake. There's some cake. I'll intend to eat that. And again, remember, this is all in the idea of constraining possibilities. So let me focus on number 4 here, target identification, because it's an easy case to kind of diagram. So remember, if we're practically reasoning here, that's an action, which again, I can put in the structure. The problem with some of the structure is that it's just not very, it's very static, right? Because this is really a process of thinking. But let me just identify the initial intention that's general. I want to eat some cake, intend to eat some cake. Here's some cake. And now for me to eat this, it's now got to be a target of my intention. Otherwise, it is merely there as an object that I experience. And so I update or fine tune my intention in this way. And there might be that I am doing this on the basis of trying to figure out what to do. So there's a second order intention to reason about my intentions. But actually, I think a lot of this updating happens, if you like, automatically. And all I mean by that for current purposes is that there's no overarching intention to act in that way, to reason in that way. Okay. What is true is that there's some attention going on here. It's automatic attention. There's perceptual attention, there's cognitive attention, and that feeds into this action of forming a kind of a decision, if you like. All right, well, that doesn't look like practical reasoning. How do we normally represent practical reasoning? We represent it as a kind of syllogism. So I intend to eat some cake. Here's some cake. I intend to eat that cake. Or straight away I might act, as I think Aristotle put it. Or since we're focusing on the contents, really, when you occupy this perspective of practical reasoning in the state of intending, you focus on eating some cake. Perception presents you with some cake, and now you're focused on that particular piece of cake as a target of your intention. So here to just put everything together, this is just the normal way of expressing the syllogism. This is expressing a kind of reasoning, which is an action. And then the way that I diagram action is through this structure. Okay, now remember, this is what I meant by talking about practical remembering as a modification of an intention. That is to say, we're beginning with a content here held in memory, which is reflecting on what our decision was. And then we make it more precise or fine tune it. All right, that's this movement here. Okay. So let me now end the last section in terms of thinking about keeping track of action. So we can think of thinking as a sequence of thoughts. It's an interesting question when this counts as an action versus not. I mentioned chapter 5 of the book, which is about inference. I mean, you can have a random sequence of thoughts that might be causally related, but it might not amount to a bout of reasoning. So there's an interesting question there. I'm just going to assume that, in fact, we do have a bit of reasoning here. And then this is like the conversation in the argument from targeted amnesia, which is that at any moment in time, you can ask me, what are you thinking? And then to make sense of it, I put it in the context of what has happened before, right? That was the condition of the continuity of practical memory. So somewhere on top of my acting, to explain why I can answer the question, why I have a grasp of my action as intentional, there has to be practical memory in play. I was suggesting that notion of memory is memory for work, and that led me to thinking about intention. So that's now what I want to bring out. Thinking is often intentional. There are interesting cases like mind wandering and rumination, spontaneous thought, creative thinking. Those are interesting cases. I'll set those aside. So I'm going to focus on a kind of specific intentional thinking about some topic T. It could be about what to eat in terms of cake. It could be about where to go on vacation when we can finally travel safely again. It could be about politics. It could be about philosophical problems. But the point of, remember again, of having a content that's geared towards even a generally specified target is that it biases that part of space in action space, which is relevant. And for example, one thing that might pop up, so to speak, automatically, are propositions that might be relevant to T. And there's an interesting question why this particular proposition or set of propositions is more likely to pop up, but it does. I'm just going to assume that here. One now is thinking P because one intends to think about cake, right? Now, if that thought pops up, it's not a flash in the cognitive pan. Rather, it's something that one has to ponder and think and maintain. So that's a bit of memory, if you'd like, this idea of maintenance. And the point here is this: if P is relevant to T, then it has to be like that piece of cake. If that's relevant to satisfy my intention to eat cake in general, then that particular, that thing, that target now becomes a target of my intention, right? Because now I want to ponder P in particular. And as a result of that, I might now think Q, and this might be a kind of inference. It might be something else, okay? Because at this point, just like when I told you I was going to grab an umbrella, and now you can ask me why I'm thinking Q, and this now is asking me to access my action, to give you a conception of it. That I think is based again on intention. So there's now this action here of responding to you by telling you what I'm doing in light of my intention. Or if you want to know exactly what I'm thinking, I put that thinking in the context of what has happened in the past. That was the continuity of practical memory. Okay, again, these diagrams are overly static. I'm really right here in my thinking. I've left this behind. I'm no longer, I mean, if this is occurring anywhere, it's because my intention got fine-tuned and updated. So now let's just start again and think about Q. Now, if Q is relevant to my thinking, I'm going to fine tune again. That is to say, like the piece of cake, if that's relevant to satisfying my intention is now going to be fine tuned to it as a target. And so that content now gets integrated or updated in the intention. And again, we have the continuity of practical memory, because that is to explain if I form a new thought R on the basis of pondering Q, that if you were to ask me again, I have access, that's the continuity of practical memory. I have access to what has gone on before. Okay, so these diagrams, I hope, are reasonably clear with a little bit of verbal kind of massaging. What's interesting then is this, I think, that when we're thinking or doing things, I'm focusing on mental action. So this could be propositional, it could actually be imagistic. So I'm just open to that. This is just a representation of the process of thinking. Because it's intentional, there's actually a second action that's parallel to this intentional action here. And it begins, you sort of have to start off here. I have an intention to think T, and now I ponder P. That happens sort of automatically. You might think of Galen Strawson's mental ballistics idea. If P is something worth pondering further, then my intention updates, and now it becomes a target of my intention. I intend to think about P in light of cake eating, politics, and whatnot. And this leads me along this path of updating and further thought. All right, so now what I want you to notice here is that this keeping track at this level is drawing on fine-tuning here, which is practical reasoning, a specification, right, on the basis of these considerations of what that help me narrow down what I should be intending. All right, so this is, if you'd like, the syllogistic kind of representation of that movement of the mind. At the same time, I can also, because I'm keeping track of action, this allows me to draw on that intention to tell you what I'm doing. And there are many sources of attention, that is to say, states that inform my response, that can help enrich the report of what I'm doing. Okay. All right, so interestingly then, there are actually two parallel actions, which might strike you as a little bit odd, but there's only one that's done intentionally, I think, in general, which is this first level action that's regulated by bias from intention. Right? The second level here is, if you'd like, automatic. There need not be a higher level intention. Perhaps there could be, but I don't see that that's necessary. And what that, I think, suggests is that there's a kind of expertise here that's tied to practical reasoning that we develop over time. And that's something to talk about further. I can't really say too much in detail because I'm almost out of time. So let me conclude. And this is the last passage on the handout. It's a kind of summary. So what I've tried to argue and hypothesize and theory construct is that intending should be thought of as practical remembering. Intention is a kind of memory, but it's also this process of remembering. And it looks to the past because it carries the content of prior decision, and it looks forward to the future in the sense that its functional role is to generate an action. When the agent finally acts, then the intention in action is one's remembering what one is doing. And it gets updated in tracking action by exercises of practical reasoning and fine-tuning. This allows the agent to keep track of what she's doing, and it grounds her conception of that action as intentional if she